There is a wall in Washington made of black granite. It does not rise above the ground like most monuments. It descends into the earth, as if the landscape itself is carrying something too heavy to hold in the open. There are 58,281 names carved into that wall. If you walked its full length and read each name aloud, it would take you nearly 3 days without sleep. Most of those names belong to young men in their late teens or early 20s. The wall does not tell you whether the war was worth it. It does not explain the strategy, the politics, or the decisions that place those names there. It only holds them and asks you to stand in front of them long enough to feel the weight. But the wall also does not tell you about the millions of Vietnamese who died in the same war, in their own country. Over 3 decades of continuous conflict, it does not tell you how the war began, why it kept escalating after so many officials privately doubted it could succeed, or why America, with all its power, could not make Vietnam become what it wanted it to become. This documentary is an attempt to tell that story honestly, not as a story of heroes and villains, not as a verdict, but as a chain of decisions made by real people under pressure, inside a history they did not fully understand, with consequences that neither side escaped unchanged. 50 years later, the argument over Vietnam still has not ended. The wall is still there, and this is the story of how the names arrived on it. Chapter 1. The Land Before the War. In the spring of 40 CE, 2 sisters from a noble Vietnamese family led an army against the most powerful empire on earth. Their names were Trung Trac and Trung Nhi. Their country had been under Chinese Han Dynasty administration for more than a century, governed by officials who collected taxes, imposed cultural requirements, and treated the local aristocracy with the casual contempt that distant empires typically extend to the people they govern. When a Chinese governor killed Trung Trac's husband, apparently to suppress a growing resistance movement, the sisters raised an army that Vietnamese historical accounts describe as numbering in the tens of thousands, drove the Chinese out of the territory that would become Vietnam, and governed an independent Vietnamese state for 3 years. Then the Han Dynasty sent a larger army. The sisters were defeated. According to Vietnamese tradition, they drowned themselves rather than surrender. According to the same tradition, they became national heroes whose story was told by every generation that followed, passed down through centuries of Chinese rule, French colonialism, and American intervention, always carrying the same message. This land has been fought for before. It will be fought for again. The story of the Trung sisters is not a footnote to the Vietnam War. It is the context without which the Vietnam War cannot be fully understood. Vietnamese identity had been shaped for roughly 2,000 years by resistance to outside domination. And that shaping was not merely historical memory. It was living culture, embedded in the stories parents told children, the ceremonies communities performed, the way people understood what their nation was and what it was capable of enduring. Most American accounts of the Vietnam War begin in 1954, when the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, or in 1964, when Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Beginning there is like reading the final chapters of a long novel and thinking you understand the story. The characters' decisions make a different kind of sense when you know what shaped them. What shaped them was this. The ancestors of the Vietnamese people had been developing a distinct civilization in the Red River Delta of what is now northern Vietnam for centuries before the Han Dynasty absorbed the territory around 111 BCE. What followed was close to 1,000 years of Chinese administrative control, interrupted repeatedly by Vietnamese rebellions that the official histories of both countries record very differently. Chinese sources describe rebellions suppressed. Vietnamese sources describe a continuous resistance that never fully accepted the legitimacy of outside rule. The Trung Sisters' Rebellion in 40 CE was one of the earliest and most celebrated. 3 centuries later, Lady Trieu led another uprising at the age of 19 before being defeated and dying in combat. In the 10th century, No Quyen defeated a Chinese naval force at the Bac Dung River by planting iron-tipped stakes in the riverbed at low tide, luring the Chinese fleet in when the water was high, then waiting for the tide to fall. In the 13th century, Tran Hung Dao defeated 3 separate Mongol invasion attempts. His military writings, still studied by Vietnamese officers in the 20th century, emphasized, in effect, using the terrain, the waterways, and the population itself as weapons against any invader, avoiding direct confrontation with superior force and making the cost of occupation higher than the value of the territory. That strategic principle was not invented in the 20th century. It was a national military tradition with centuries of documented successful application. When General Vo Nguyen Gia described his approach to fighting American forces in Vietnam, he was drawing on a tradition that predated the United States by more than 1,000 years. The Cold War framework that shaped American policy in Vietnam treated the country as a piece in a global strategic contest, a domino whose falling would trigger a cascade of communist victories across Southeast Asia. That framework was not without any logic given what American policymakers believed in the 1950s. But it was also incomplete in a way that proved consequential. It described Vietnam in terms of what it meant to Washington, rather than what it was to the people living there, and what it was to the people living there. After 2,000 years of the specific history described above, was their country. The question of who governed it was not primarily ideological. It was the question that every generation of Vietnamese had faced and answered in roughly the same way. To understand the man whose name the war would eventually carry in Vietnamese memory, you have to start not with communism, but with colonialism. France began its colonial presence in Vietnam in the 1850s, initially under the stated purpose of protecting Catholic missionaries, and by 1887 had consolidated Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos into a single colonial territory called French Indochina. The economic structure of the enterprise was systematic. Vietnamese rice, rubber, coal, and labor were extracted for the benefit of French investors and the French treasury. The Vietnamese population that produced this wealth received almost no political representation, faced taxation that French colonial economists' own internal reports described as among the heaviest in Asia, and were educated at a level calibrated to produce compliant administrators rather than independent thinkers. They produced independent thinkers anyway. Among them was a man born in 1890 in Nghệ An province, the son of a Confucian scholar who had refused to collaborate with the French administration. His given name was Nguyen Sin Cung. History would know him as Ho Chi Minh. He left Vietnam in 1911, working as a laborer on a French ocean liner, and spent the next 3 decades traveling through Europe, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, studying political ideas from every direction with the focused intensity of someone who had made this his life's work. He was in Paris in 1919 during the Versailles Peace Conference, and he did something that reveals the essential nature of who he was at that moment. He put on a rented suit, drafted a petition calling for Vietnamese self-determination based on the principles that President Woodrow Wilson had publicly championed, and attempted to present it to the American delegation. There is no evidence Wilson personally engaged with the petition. It went nowhere. It was substantially after that experience that Ho Chi Minh turned seriously toward communist theory, and his own later writings make the sequence clear. In Lenin's writings on imperialism and national liberation, he found the first major international political framework that explicitly named colonialism as a system to be dismantled and promised concrete support to peoples seeking independence from European empires. The ideology provided a vehicle for the nationalism that had always been his primary motivation. Cold War policymakers later described him primarily as a Soviet agent or a Chinese proxy. The evidence of his own biography suggests something different. He was a Vietnamese nationalist who adopted communist ideology as the most available framework for achieving Vietnamese independence. That distinction is not academic. It is the central fact that American policy failed to adequately reckon with for 30 years. In 1940, France fell to Germany in 6 weeks. The Japanese moved into Indochina and established effective military control while leaving the French administrative apparatus nominally in place. For Vietnamese observing this, the lesson was significant. The European power that had held their country for nearly a century could not defend its own homeland against a determined adversary. Ho Chi Minh crossed back into Vietnam in 1941 for the first time in 30 years and organized the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. The movement fought the Japanese during the Second World War, rescued downed American pilots, and provided intelligence to the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor of the CIA. American officers who worked with Ho Chi Minh during this period described him in their field reports as a committed nationalist and a capable leader. When Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnamese independence on September 2, 1945, in Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square, before a crowd estimated at several 100,000 people, he opened his speech by drawing on the American Declaration of Independence, invoking the principle that all people are endowed with certain rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He had reasons both genuine and strategic for making that invocation. He believed, or hoped, that America, which had just fought a world war against imperialism and which publicly championed self-determination, might support Vietnamese independence. The United States chose instead to support France's return to Indochina. Cold War considerations, the perceived need to keep France stable and strong in Europe, and a failure to adequately distinguish between Vietnamese nationalism and Soviet-directed communism all contributed to that choice. As one internal State Department analysis from this period acknowledged, Cold War priorities had outweighed anti-colonial principles. That decision, made in the first years after the Second World War, set in motion a chain of events that would eventually place 58,281 American names on a black granite wall in Washington. The French returned. The First Vietnam War began, and the pattern that would define the next 30 years was already established. A resistance movement with deep roots in the population, sustained by a national tradition 2,000 years old, fighting against a foreign power that believed superior resources would eventually be sufficient. The French were about to discover the cost of that belief at a place called Dien Bien Phu. Chapter 2. The First War, France Falls. On the afternoon of March 13, 1954, General Vo Nguyen Giap sat in a command post in the mountains above the valley of Dien Bien Phu and gave the order to open fire. What happened in the next few hours destroyed the French plan for winning the war in Indochina. destroyed the career of the French officer who had guaranteed it could not happen, and delivered a lesson about the nature of this specific conflict that the next foreign power to enter Vietnam would spend years failing to absorb. The French base at Dien Bien Phu had been established in November of 1953. Ordered by French Commander-in-Chief General Henri Navarre, and built in a natural valley in northwestern Vietnam, close to the Laotian border. Navarre's plan was to use it as bait. The Viet Minh would be drawn into attacking a fortified position where French firepower, artillery, and air power would destroy them in the open. The plan rested on a specific and load-bearing assumption. The surrounding mountains were too steep and too densely jungled for the Viet Minh to move heavy artillery into firing positions on the ridgelines above the base. Without artillery on the high ground, the French airstrip remained operational. The base could be resupplied and reinforced, and French firepower would dominate any engagement in the valley below. Giap spent 4 months systematically dismantling that assumption. He mobilized approximately 100,000 soldiers and civilians to disassemble artillery pieces, carry the components through mountain jungle, on foot and on bicycles and on improvised wooden sledges, and reassemble them in reinforced positions dug into the hillsides above the French lines, with the barrels angled downward at the airstrip below. The operation moved at night to avoid French air observation. It required moving objects weighing several tons through terrain with no roads. Sustained by a collective commitment and organizational discipline that military historians, including Bernard Fall in his detailed account of the battle, have described as one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of modern warfare. When Jeep's artillery opened fire on March 13th, French strongpoint Beatrice fell within hours. The French airstrip was rendered unusable within days. Colonel Charles Piroth, the French artillery commander who had personally guaranteed that the Viet Minh could not bring heavy guns to bear on the valley, went to his bunker and killed himself. The battle lasted 56 days. On May 7, 1954, the last French positions were overrun. Approximately 11,000 troops surrendered at the base itself. According to Bernard Fall's account, in hell in a very small place, with additional casualties and prisoners taken during the battle's earlier phases. It was the first time in the modern era that an Asian independence movement had defeated a major European colonial power in a set-piece military engagement. The political consequences extended far beyond Indochina. What most accounts of Dien Bien Phu omit is the American dimension. By 1954, the United States was funding roughly up to 80% of France's military costs in Indochina, a proportion that had grown steadily since President Truman's decision in 1950 to back the French effort after the Korean War made communist expansion in Asia feel like an urgent threat. American money, American weapons, American aircraft, all of it committed in service of a colonial enterprise that the State Department's own internal analyses had repeatedly described as politically unsustainable. Those analyses identified a specific problem that money and weapons could not solve. The Viet Minh's appeal was not primarily ideological. It drew its strength from the same tradition of resistance to outside rule that Vietnamese identity had been built on for 2,000 years. In the eyes of the Vietnamese population whose support determined the war's outcome, the French were occupiers. American funding made America complicit in that occupation, regardless of what American officials believed about their own intentions. This was documented. It was analyzed. It was set aside because the alternative, accepting a communist-affiliated government in Vietnam, seemed worse than the contradictions of backing colonialism. The Geneva Conference that followed Dien Bien Phu in the summer of 1954 produced agreements signed by France and the Viet Minh that temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. With Ho Chi Minh's government in the north and a non-communist administration in the south, the word temporarily was not decorative. The accords explicitly called for nationwide elections in July of 1956 to reunify the country under a single government chosen by the Vietnamese people. Every serious assessment of the political situation in 1954 reached the same conclusion about those elections. Ho Chi Minh would win by a substantial margin. President Eisenhower himself acknowledged in his memoirs that he believed Ho Chi Minh would have received something in the range of 80% of the vote. The elections were never held. The United States, working through its newly backed leader in the South, Ngo Dinh Diem, declined to participate in the electoral process the accords had established. The stated justification was that free elections could not be guaranteed in the Communist North. The practical calculation was that Washington was not willing to risk losing through a ballot what had not been held through 8 years of funded warfare. That decision, to substitute American strategic preference for an internationally agreed political process, is the point from which most of what followed flows directly. The war America would fight for the next 20 years grew from a choice to prevent the Vietnamese people from exercising the self-determination that American values publicly championed. The documentary record is clear about this. An honest accounting of the war's origins requires stating it plainly. The lesson of Dien Bien Phu was available in plain language. A force supplied by human back and bicycle, animated by a national cause with deep historical roots, had defeated a modern Western military with armor, artillery, and air support. The French had not lost for lack of resources. They had lost because the population of the country they were fighting in did not want them to win. America read that lesson, documented it, analyzed it in reports that remain readable today, and then concluded that America, with greater resources and a cleaner ideological case than France had been able to make, would do better. That confidence was not irrational. It was, however, built on a misreading of what had actually defeated France. And the first step toward discovering the cost of that misreading was choosing a leader for South Vietnam. Chapter 3. Building a nation that couldn't stand. In the summer of 1954, a 46-year-old Vietnamese Mandarin named Ngo Dinh Diem stepped off a plane in Saigon carrying American backing and almost nothing else that the task ahead of him required. He was, in some respects, a genuine Vietnamese patriot. He had refused to collaborate with the French during the colonial period and had also refused to join Ho Chi Minh's movement, which he regarded as trading French domination for communist domination. He was intelligent, personally incorruptible in the financial sense, and possessed of a deep conviction that he was the man Vietnam needed. He was also a devout Catholic in a country that was roughly 90% Buddhist, an aristocrat from a Mandarin family in a country whose population was overwhelmingly rural and poor, and a man who had spent years outside Vietnam cultivating relationships with American Catholics, including Cardinal Francis Spellman and a young Massachusetts senator named John F. Kennedy. He had no significant political base inside Vietnam. He had no military following. He had almost no organizational infrastructure of any kind beyond his family and a small circle of associates. What he had was American backing. And in the summer of 1954, American backing came with enough money and weapons to make the other deficiencies seem manageable. They were not manageable. They were fundamental. And the failure to reckon with them honestly at the beginning determined the character of everything that followed. Diem's method of consolidating power reflected both his genuine belief in the communist threat and his deep personal distrust of anyone outside his immediate family. His brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, became his chief political advisor and enforcer. Another brother, Ngo Dinh Can, became the effective political boss of Central Vietnam. A third brother, Ngo Dinh Thuc, served as Archbishop of Hue. The government of South Vietnam became, in essential structure, a family operation funded by American resources. Political opposition was treated as communist subversion, with a consistency that made no distinction between genuine security threats and ordinary political dissent. Legislation passed in 1955 allowed the government to arrest, try by military tribunal, and execute anyone deemed to be engaging in activities harmful to national defense. A definition elastic enough to cover virtually any organized challenge to the regime. Thousands of people, including many former Viet Minh members who had remained in the South after the Geneva Partition and had no current political affiliation, were arrested, imprisoned, or killed. American officials documented these problems in internal reports from the very beginning. Embassy cables described a government systematically alienating the population it needed to win over. Military advisors noted that the focus on physical security, while ignoring political legitimacy, was producing the opposite of its intended effect in the countryside. These assessments reached senior officials in Washington, were weighed against the perceived cost of abandoning South Vietnam, and were consistently found to be a secondary concern. The Strategic Hamlet Program, launched in 1962 and initially embraced by American advisors as a potentially decisive strategy, illustrates how the pattern worked in practice. The concept had genuine strategic logic. The Viet Cong insurgency drew its strength from the rural population, move that population into fortified villages, provide security and basic services, and you deny the insurgency its base of support. The theory was not foolish. The execution was catastrophic. Vietnamese peasants had a relationship with their ancestral land that American planners, operating with a different cultural framework, did not adequately appreciate. The land where their ancestors were buried, where their families had worked for generations, was not simply an agricultural resource. It was the center of their spiritual and social identity. When government officials arrived and announced that a village was being relocated to a new hamlet, often miles away, often without meaningful compensation, the response was not gratitude for the security being offered. It was a grievance that turned neutral or potentially cooperative peasants into people with personal reasons to resent the Saigon government. By 1962, American field advisors were sending reports to Washington describing strategic hamlets as largely hollow, with relocated populations whose loyalties had moved in exactly the wrong direction. These reports reached Washington. The official assessment remained optimistic. This gap between field reality and official reporting became a structural feature of the American involvement almost from its beginning. It had a nickname inside the military community in Saigon, the 5 o'clock Follies, referring to the daily press briefings where American spokesmen described progress that journalists and officers in the field found difficult to reconcile with what they were actually observing. The credibility gap that would eventually collapse public support for the war was not born in 1968. It was constructed incrementally from the earliest years of American engagement with the Diem government. The Buddhist crisis of 1963 brought the internal contradictions of the Diem regime to a point they could no longer be managed quietly. In May of that year, government troops in Hue fired on a crowd gathered to celebrate the Buddha's birthday, killing 9 people. The immediate cause was an order banning the display of Buddhist flags. The deeper cause was years of accumulated resentment among the Buddhist majority over favoritism shown to Catholics in government appointments. Military promotions and land distribution. The regime's response to the protests that followed was escalation rather than conciliation. News special forces raided Buddhist pagodas across the country in August, arresting hundreds of monks and nuns, and producing images of soldiers in combat gear, dragging robed clergy through the streets that circulated around the world. In June, a 66-year-old Buddhist monk named Teek Quang Duc sat down at a busy Saigon intersection, assumed the lotus position, and set himself on fire. He did not move as he burned. The photograph, taken by AP journalist Malcolm Brown, appeared on front pages worldwide and produced a reaction in Washington that official statements about the war's progress had not been producing. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge arrived in Saigon in August of 1963, and within weeks was reporting to Washington that the DIEN government had lost whatever governing legitimacy it might once have had, and that the war could not be won with DIEN in power. Through a series of communications whose precise meaning historians have debated ever since, the Kennedy administration signaled to a group of South Vietnamese military officers that Washington would not oppose a change of government. On November 1st, 1963, those officers staged a coup. Diem and his brother Nhu fled the presidential palace, sought refuge in a Catholic church in Cholon, surrendered with assurances of safe conduct, and were shot dead in the back of an armored vehicle. President Kennedy received the news in Washington and was, by multiple accounts, genuinely shaken by the killings. The degree to which the administration's signals had made the outcome predictable, and the degree to which American officials had thought through the implications before sending those signals, remains one of the genuinely contested questions of this period. What is not contested is what came next. In the 16 months between Diem's assassination and the arrival of American combat troops in March of 1965, South Vietnam had 9 different governments. 9. Some lasted months. Some lasted weeks. The military and civilian leadership that effective governance required cycled through power with a speed that made any consistent policy essentially impossible. The assessments reaching Washington by early 1965 described a situation deteriorating faster than any adjustment could address. The South Vietnamese military was losing the war. The government in Saigon lacked the institutional coherence and popular legitimacy to function as an independent state without permanent external support. These assessments were accurate. They were also not sufficient to produce a fundamental reconsideration of American policy. Instead, they produced what had become the characteristic American response to bad news from Vietnam since 1954. They produced escalation, and with escalation came a question that no one in Washington had yet answered honestly. A question that would define the next decade of American involvement. How do you win a war when the government you are fighting for cannot win the loyalty of its own people? Chapter 4. The Slide into War. On the night of August 4th, 1964, a young radar operator aboard the USS Maddox sat at his equipment in the Gulf of Tonkin and watched his screen with the specific kind of attention that comes from knowing you have already been in a real engagement and might be in another. 2 nights earlier, the Maddox had been in a genuine encounter with North Vietnamese torpedo boats, one of the first direct engagements between American naval forces and North Vietnamese military units in the escalating conflict. Tonight the seas were rough. The weather was poor, and the conditions made reliable sensor readings difficult. The contacts appearing on his screen suggested something was out there. He reported what he saw. His report moved up the chain of command with a speed that outpaced careful evaluation. By the time it reached Washington, It had become the basis for a presidential address to the nation. The problem was that the Maddox's own captain, John Herrick, had already sent a cable to Washington within hours of the initial reports urging caution. Weather conditions and the heightened alert following the earlier genuine engagement might account for the contacts being reported. Herrick wrote, he recommended that no action be taken until the evidence could be carefully evaluated. That cable reached Washington. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was briefed on its contents. The decision was made to proceed as if the attack had definitively occurred. President Lyndon Johnson went on national television, described attacks on American naval vessels, and announced retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese facilities. 2 days later, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed the Senate by 88 votes to 2 and the House by 416 votes to 0. It authorized the president to take all necessary measures to repel attacks against American forces and to prevent further aggression in Southeast Asia. Senate consideration of the resolution was minimal by the standards of any major legislation. It gave the president effectively unlimited authority to wage war in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon, one of the 2 dissenting votes, warned that Congress was handing the executive branch a power it would regret. Senator Ernest Gruening of Alaska, the other dissenting vote, called it a predated declaration of war. Both were correct. The Pentagon Papers, the classified Defense Department history of the Vietnam War commissioned by McNamara and leaked to the press by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, revealed that the administration had been preparing for escalation well before the Tonkin incident. Draft resolutions granting broad war powers had been prepared months in advance. Officials privately expressed doubts about the evidence for the second attack that they did not voice publicly. A genuinely ambiguous event was presented to Congress and the country with a certainty the evidence did not support. To understand why this happened requires understanding the specific pressures shaping Lyndon Johnson's decisions about Vietnam, because they illuminate the entire logic of the escalation that followed. Johnson was a domestic policy president whose political identity was invested in the Great Society programs he intended as his legacy. He had no desire for a war in Asia and said so privately with considerable bluntness. But he also carried a fear, both personal and political, of being the president who lost Vietnam to communism. The right would destroy him. The credibility of American commitments globally would be questioned. The domestic agenda he cared about most would be consumed by the political fallout. This fear of what losing Vietnam would cost him politically at home shaped Johnson's decisions more than any strategic assessment of what was actually happening on the ground. It was a calculation made in the language of political survival rather than military strategy. And it was not unique to Johnson. Each of his predecessors had faced a version of the same calculation and reached a similar conclusion. The political cost of admitting that the project was failing felt higher than the cost of continuing. Eisenhower had drawn the line at combat troops and held it. Kennedy had escalated the advisory mission to the point where the line was difficult to see clearly. Each president had passed a slightly worse situation to the next. And each next president had found honest reckoning with the fundamental problem more politically costly than another increment of escalation. By the time Johnson inherited the situation in November of 1963, South Vietnam was losing the war, and its political structure was in open crisis. The choice, as his advisors framed it, was between escalating American involvement and accepting a communist South Vietnam. Framed that way, with the Cold War context of 1964 as the backdrop, escalation was the option that felt manageable, and acceptance was the option that felt catastrophic. In February of 1965, Viet Cong forces attacked an American installation at Pleiku. killing 8 Americans. Johnson ordered retaliatory airstrikes. Within days, what had been presented as retaliation had become a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam called Operation Rolling Thunder. Within a month, the first American combat Marines landed near Da Nang. What is most striking in the internal deliberations of the Johnson administration during this period is not dishonesty in any simple sense. Several of the people making these decisions were among the most intellectually capable individuals ever to hold senior positions in the American government. What is striking is the absence, document after document, of a coherent theory connecting the military actions being taken to the political outcome the war required. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy wrote in a memorandum in February of 1965 that the current policy was a losing course and the situation was deteriorating. His recommendation was escalation anyway, on the grounds that a more dramatic commitment might change the dynamic in ways that continued half measures could not. It was not confidence that escalation would work. It was the calculation that escalation was better than the alternative of admitting, in public, that the project was failing. That logic, sustained by political pressure and institutional momentum rather than strategic conviction, would drive American policy for the next 8 years. It would produce, eventually, the outcome that each escalation was designed to prevent. And on the USS Maddox, somewhere in the middle of all of that, a radar operator's uncertain report on a rough night in the Gulf of Tonkin had become the occasion, if not the cause, of a war. Chapter 5. The American War. On a humid morning in the summer of 1966, a young soldier from a small town stood in a rice paddy in the Mekong Delta and tried to understand where the shooting was coming from. He had been in Vietnam for 7 weeks. The training had covered weapons and tactics and the forms of discipline that armies require. It had not covered this, the heat that pressed down like something physical, the landscape that offered no reference points his training had prepared him for. The enemy who was present enough to be killing people and absent enough to be invisible. The village 100 meters away that might be sheltering fighters or might be sheltering farmers or might be both. And no one around him was certain which. He was among the youngest soldiers in any American military force of the 20th century. He would serve 12 months and rotate home, after which someone else would stand in the same paddy trying to understand the same landscape. The war would continue whether he understood it or not. General William Westmoreland, who commanded American forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, had a strategy for this war. It was called attrition, and it rested on a concept called the crossover point. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong had a finite number of fighters. If American forces could kill enemy combatants faster than they could be replaced, the enemy's capacity to sustain the war would eventually collapse. The crossover point was the moment enemy losses exceeded the rate of replenishment. Reach it, and the military logic of the war would resolve itself. The strategy required measurement, and the primary metric it produced became one of the most corrosive features of the entire American war effort. The body count, the number of enemy fighters killed, became the principal measure by which progress was assessed and commanders at every level were evaluated. Units reporting high enemy casualties received favorable assessments. Units reporting low numbers faced questions about their aggressiveness. The incentive structure pointed in one direction with considerable clarity, and the consequences were predictable. The numbers produced bore an increasingly uncertain relationship to military reality. Distinguishing enemy combatants from civilians in a war fought without uniforms, in and around populated villages, was genuinely difficult in many situations. Vietnamese males of military age, found dead in combat zones, were frequently counted as enemy fighters, regardless of whether any evidence supported that classification. Civilians killed in airstrikes or artillery barrages sometimes appeared in the totals. The body count numbers moved upward through a chain of command that had its own institutional reasons to accept them. The crossover point never arrived. North Vietnam proved willing to absorb casualties at a rate that American planners had calculated would be unsustainable, and that turned out to be sustained year after year without visible effect on Hanoi's determination to continue. For every American killed, the ratio of enemy dead was consistently and sometimes dramatically higher. And yet, the fighters kept coming south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The arithmetic of attrition was not producing the result the arithmetic had promised. General Giap understood the asymmetry from the beginning. In various accounts from this period, he articulated the strategic logic that guided North Vietnamese military planning. In any contest between a democratic power and a determined national movement, time favors the movement. A democratic government must show its citizens progress. It must manage casualties at a level the political system can sustain. Its decision-making runs on a cycle of elections and public opinion that the other side can observe and plan around. A movement fighting for its own territory can absorb losses that a democratic public would never accept for their own soldiers. Because the cause is not abstract, it is immediate and existential. This was not a new insight. It was the same strategic logic that had outlasted every previous foreign army that had entered Vietnamese territory. Giap was applying a framework with centuries of successful application to a new adversary. The 12-month individual rotation policy, designed to distribute the burden of service fairly among American soldiers, produced an army that was constantly losing its most experienced fighters just as they became most effective. Units rebuilt their competence and dispersed it on a 12-month cycle that served individual soldiers at the cost of institutional learning. The search and destroy operations that Westmoreland's strategy required sent American units into areas of suspected Viet Cong activity to engage and destroy enemy forces. Then return to base. American units would move through an area, fight whatever engagement they encountered, and withdraw. The Viet Cong, embedded in the local population and able to move fluidly between fighter and farmer, would return as soon as the Americans departed. The same villages cycled between nominal government control and Viet Cong influence without any clear movement toward resolution. You could fight for a hill at significant cost and then be ordered to abandon it because holding terrain was not the point of the strategy. The same hill might have to be fought for again the following season. The air war added its own dimensions to the American effort. Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that ran from March of 1965 to October of 1968, dropped enormous tonnage on North Vietnamese infrastructure, transportation networks, and military facilities. The destruction was real and costly. It was not sufficient to paralyze the North Vietnamese war effort or force Hanoi to negotiate on American terms. Roads and bridges destroyed by bombing were rebuilt within days by civilian work brigades. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, despite sustained interdiction bombing over the course of the entire war, kept flowing. The bombing also imposed costs that complicated American strategic and diplomatic positions. Civilian casualties, in numbers that American briefings minimized and that independent estimates suggest were substantial, gave North Vietnam a narrative that resonated across Asia and the developing world and affected American relationships with countries whose support Washington needed. The civilians of South Vietnam, caught between the forces contesting their country, paid a price that no official metric was designed to capture. Villages suspected of sheltering Viet Cong were sometimes destroyed, a phrase widely reported in connection with the destruction of the provincial town of Ben Tre in 1968, that it had been necessary to destroy the town in order to save it, was attributed in AP reporting to an American officer, though the precise source of the quote has been questioned by some researchers in subsequent years. Whatever its exact origin, it described a logic that was real in the operational conduct of the war. By the end of 1967, more than 480,000 American military personnel were in Vietnam. Official briefings described steady progress. General Westmoreland told a Washington audience in November of 1967 that the end was coming into view, that the crossover point was approaching, that light was visible at the end of the tunnel. 2 months later, the largest coordinated military operation of the entire war began, and the light at the end of the tunnel turned out to be a train. Chapter 6. Tet and the Breaking Point. In the early morning hours of January 31st, 1968, a journalist covering the war from Saigon was awakened by the sound of explosions. He went to his window and looked out at a city that was simultaneously on fire in multiple directions. Across more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces were launching coordinated attacks in an operation whose scale and ambition had been concealed from American intelligence with a thoroughness that made the confident predictions of the previous months look hollow in a new and particular way. More than 80,000 fighters were involved across the country. They hit provincial capitals, military installations, the headquarters of the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff, the national radio station. A 19-man Viet Cong squad blasted through the wall of the American Embassy compound and held the grounds for 6 hours. The operation had been planned for months, using the cover of the Tet holiday and the seasonal movement of civilians to position fighters and weapons in cities across the country. Standing at his window, the journalist understood something that would take the American public several more days to process. Whatever the official briefings had been saying, whatever the body count numbers had been reporting, this was not what a defeated enemy looked like. On purely military terms, the Tet Offensive failed to achieve its primary objectives. The popular uprising in the South that Hanoi had expected the attacks to trigger did not materialize. In most cities, attacking forces were driven back within days. The losses in experienced Viet Cong fighters and in the underground political infrastructure that had taken years to build were severe. By conventional measures of military outcome, American and South Vietnamese forces won the Tet Offensive. The attacking forces were repelled. The cities held. The war did not proceed as if they had won. On February 27, 1968, Walter Cronkite ended a special CBS News broadcast about Tet with an editorial statement that he had not made before in his career as an anchor. He said it seemed more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam was to end in a stalemate, and that the only rational way out would be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who had done the best they could. Polls conducted during this period consistently placed Cronkite among the most trusted figures in American public life. The broadcast reached an estimated 10 million households that evening. What those households heard was not a critique from someone associated with the anti-war movement. It was a measured statement from a man who had covered the Second World War in Korea, and who was telling them, in his measured voice, that the official account of the war's progress could no longer be sustained. President Johnson reportedly told an aide after watching the broadcast that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. The precise words are disputed in various accounts. But what Johnson did 5 weeks later is not disputed. On March 31st, 1968, in a nationally televised address, he announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam, called for negotiations, and then, in the final minutes, announced that he would not seek and would not accept his party's nomination for another term as president. The man who had won the presidency 4 years earlier by the largest popular vote margin in American history to that point had been driven from office by a war he had not sought, could not win on the terms he had committed to, and could not end on terms he could defend. Here is what the standard account of Tet sometimes misses. The offensive did not turn Americans against the war primarily because of what happened in Vietnam. Public support for the war had been declining steadily for more than a year before Tet. Tracking closely with the weekly casualty figures reported on the evening news, what Tet changed was not primarily the direction of public opinion. It changed the terms on which the official narrative could be maintained. Before Tet, the administration could point to progress. The crossover point was approaching. Westmoreland had just told Congress that the end was coming into view. Tet did not prove that every particular of those claims was false. What it proved, in a way that no official communication could walk back, was that the people making those claims did not have reliable knowledge of what was actually happening in Vietnam. An enemy described as near collapse had just launched the largest coordinated military operation of the entire war across more than 100 cities simultaneously. Whatever the tactical outcome, the credibility of the entire official account was gone. And credibility, once gone in that particular way, does not return. The My Lai massacre, which occurred in March of 1968, but was not publicly reported until November of 1969, when investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story, added a different and darker dimension to the public reckoning. On March 16th, soldiers of Charlie Company entered the hamlet of My Lai in Quang Ngai province. They found no Viet Cong fighters. Over the course of the morning, between 300 and 500 civilians were killed. The massacre was covered up at multiple levels of the military chain of command for more than a year before an Army veteran named Ron Ridenour, who had heard accounts from soldiers who were present, wrote letters to members of Congress demanding investigation. The question My Lai raised was not comfortable. Was it an exceptional event produced by the specific failures of a specific unit? Or did the strategy, the tactics, and the operational culture of the American war create conditions in which the line between combatant and civilian had become so eroded that events like My Lai were not aberrations but predictable outcomes? Veterans who spoke publicly in the years after My Lai gave answers that pointed in the latter direction. None of this diminishes the service and courage of the hundreds of thousands of American soldiers who served in Vietnam without committing atrocities, who maintained their integrity under conditions of extraordinary stress, and who came home to a country that did not adequately acknowledge what they had done or what had been done to them. The failure of Vietnam was not a failure of the soldiers who fought it. It was a failure of the strategy that sent them there without honest objectives, without reliable metrics, and without a coherent theory connecting military action to political outcome. Tet broke the Johnson presidency. It broke the official narrative of progress. It broke Westmoreland's command. What it did not break, immediately, was the war itself. That would take nearly 7 more years, more American deaths than had occurred before Tet, and a presidency consumed by a different kind of deception. The journalist at the window had seen enough that morning to understand what the next several years would bring. He filed his report, and somewhere in Washington, the people responsible for the official account of the war began the long process of figuring out what to say next, knowing that whatever they said It would be measured against what the cameras had already shown. Chapter 7. NIXON'S WAR. In the fall of 1968, a Vietnamese woman named Nguyen Thi Binh was preparing to join the negotiations in Paris as a representative of the National Liberation Front, the political arm of the Southern insurgency. She had spent most of her adult life in the resistance. She had been imprisoned and tortured by the DIEN government in the late 1950s. She had emerged from that experience with a clarity about what the war was and what it would require that the American officials across the negotiating table had not yet fully developed. In various post-war accounts, she described her understanding from the beginning of the Paris talks that America was not negotiating to end the war. America was negotiating to leave it. Those were different things, and the difference between them would determine what happened to Vietnam after the Americans were gone. Richard Nixon won the presidency in November of 1968 on the promise that he had a plan to end the Vietnam War. He declined to specify what the plan was, explaining that revealing it would compromise ongoing negotiations. The voters, exhausted by Johnson's war and desperate for an exit that preserved some recognizable version of American purpose, gave him the benefit of the doubt. The plan, as it unfolded over the following years, was not a plan to end the war. It was a plan to change who was visibly fighting it while maintaining the essential American objective: a South Vietnam that would survive as an independent, non-communist state. Nixon called it Vietnamization. American combat troops would be gradually withdrawn. South Vietnamese forces, massively equipped and trained, would take over the fighting. American air power and money would continue to support them. The casualty rate that American families experienced would fall, reducing the most immediate source of domestic pressure. While the war itself continued, the political logic was coherent. The strategic logic was built on the same flawed foundation that had undermined American policy since 1955. South Vietnam's fundamental problem had never been a shortage of weapons or trained soldiers. It had been a deficit of political legitimacy and institutional coherence that no quantity of American military equipment could compensate for. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam had American weapons in quantities that exceeded those of most countries in the world by 1970. Whether those weapons would be used with the commitment that survival required was not a question that could be answered by supplying more of them. Nixon's primary instrument for achieving his goals was Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor and later Secretary of State. Kissinger brought to Vietnam a geopolitical framework organized around great power competition and the management of Soviet and Chinese influence. His approach to forcing Hanoi toward a negotiated settlement relied primarily on military pressure, specifically air power applied to North Vietnam and to North Vietnamese supply networks running through Laos and Cambodia. The specific form this pressure took produced consequences extending far beyond Vietnam. Cambodia, under Prince Norodom Sihanouk, had maintained a precarious neutrality throughout the war. Sihanouk was not sympathetic to the North Vietnamese, but was a pragmatist who understood that his small country could not survive direct confrontation with either side. He tolerated, without endorsing, the use of Cambodian territory along the Vietnamese border as a sanctuary and supply route. He looked the other way because confronting it would have drawn Cambodia fully into the war. Nixon and Kissinger decided to strike those sanctuaries regardless. Beginning in March of 1969, the United States conducted a secret bombing campaign against Cambodian territory. The secrecy was deliberate and extensive. The bombing was concealed not only from the American public and Congress, but from most of the American government itself. Falsified flight records were submitted to disguise the true targets. The chain of command was bypassed to prevent the operations from appearing in documents accessible to congressional oversight. Over the following years, the United States dropped enormous tonnage on Cambodian territory. By some estimates, subject to ongoing methodological debate among historians, the total was among the highest concentrated bombing of any single country in the history of aerial warfare. The bombing damaged North Vietnamese supply networks and had real military effect. It also contributed to the destabilization of a country that had maintained fragile peace. Killed Cambodian civilians in numbers that remain disputed but are certainly substantial, and helped create the conditions of political chaos that the Khmer Rouge was able to exploit in its rise to power. The precise causal relationship between the bombing and the Khmer Rouge genocide is debated by historians, and honest accounting requires acknowledging that the Khmer Rouge had indigenous roots and motivations independent of American policy. But the bombing contributed to conditions the Khmer Rouge exploited, and that contribution is part of the war's full accounting. In April of 1970, Nixon announced the expansion of the war into Cambodia, with American and South Vietnamese ground forces crossing the border. On May 4, 1970, National Guardsmen opened fire on students at Kent State University in Ohio who were protesting the invasion. 4 students were killed. 9 were wounded. One of those killed, Allison Krauss, was 19 years old. She had placed a flower in the barrel of a National Guardsman's rifle the day before she died. The photographs from Kent State circulated around the world. A nationwide student strike closed hundreds of American universities. Polls showed that a majority of Americans now believe the war had been a mistake. The gap between the government and a substantial portion of the public it governed was no longer simply political disagreement. It was becoming something that threatened the basic social contract between a democratic government and its citizens. Nixon's response combined tactical withdrawal of American ground forces, reducing the visible casualty rate, with continued and in some respects intensified air operations that kept the war fully lethal across Southeast Asia while making it less visible at home. American troop levels came down steadily. The air war continued. The bombing of Cambodia and Laos continued and expanded. Kissinger and North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho met secretly for years in the outskirts of Paris, constructing the architecture of an agreement that both sides understood would be a framework for American withdrawal rather than a genuine resolution of the conflict. By October of 1972, they were close to terms. The agreement acknowledged the continued presence of North Vietnamese forces in the South, called for a ceasefire, provided for the return of American prisoners of war, and established a political process for South Vietnam's future that both sides understood Hanoi would eventually dominate. Nguyen Van Thieu, the South Vietnamese president, rejected the agreement. He understood its terms with the clarity of someone whose country's survival was directly at stake. The continued presence of North Vietnamese forces in the South was, in Thieu's reading, a slow death sentence on a delayed schedule. In December of 1972, Nixon ordered the most intensive bombing campaign of the entire war. For 11 days, beginning on December 18th, American B-52 bombers struck Hanoi and Haiphong in operations that became known as the Christmas bombing. The stated purpose was to demonstrate, resolve, and pressure Hanoi back to the table. Critics described the campaign as disproportionate. Defenders argued it produced the agreement that followed. What the historical record shows is that the agreement signed on January 27, 1973, was not substantially different from the terms available in October. Whether the Christmas bombing was necessary to achieve the marginal differences in the final text is a question that historians have answered differently based on their reading of an incomplete record. And intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that uncertainty. The Paris Peace Accords were signed. Nixon called it peace with honor. Kissinger and Le Duc Tho were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Those declined to accept it, saying that peace had not actually been established in Vietnam. Whether the accords deserve the name peace with honor is one of the war's hardest and most genuinely contested questions. The answer depends on what you believe the realistic alternatives were, what obligations America owed to the South Vietnamese people, and what the word honor requires in circumstances where all available options involve some form of failure. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March of 1973. The prisoners of war came home. The visible American presence in Vietnam ended. The war did not end. And the people who would live through what came next were the people who had always paid the highest price in this war. They were Vietnamese. Chapter 8. The Other Side of the War. On a mountain road in Nha and province in North Vietnam. Sometime in 1967, a young woman was working in the dark. She was part of a youth volunteer brigade responsible for maintaining a section of road that American bombing had been trying to destroy for months. The work happened mostly at night, filling craters, clearing debris, keeping the surface passable for the trucks and bicycles moving supplies south. During the day, the brigade took cover and waited. When the bombing stopped, they went back out. Vietnamese historical accounts credit a young woman named No Thi Thuyen from this period with acts of extraordinary physical endurance during these operations, including, according to those accounts, carrying ammunition and supplies when wounded male soldiers could not continue. She was awarded the title Hero of the People's Armed Forces, one of North Vietnam's highest recognitions. Whether the specific details of her cited feats accumulated the weight of legend over time, as accounts of wartime heroism often do, what is documented is the recognition itself and what it represented. The North Vietnamese war effort was sustained not only by soldiers, but by hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, a large proportion of them women, performing extraordinary labor under conditions of continuous danger, night after night, on roads that American air power spent enormous resources trying to destroy. That story has almost no presence in the American account of the Vietnam War. This absence is not a minor omission. It is a structural feature of how the war has been told in English. And correcting it is not a matter of political sympathy for one side or the other. It is the prerequisite for understanding why the war ended the way it did. The Vietnamese were not the backdrop of an American story. They were the primary actors in a struggle that was fundamentally and irreducibly theirs. And understanding their experience, their strategy, their cost, and their motivations is central to understanding the war. Not supplementary. Central. Start with Ho Chi Minh, who died in September of 1969 at the age of 79. 6 years before the war, he had given his life to end it. He had asked in his will to be cremated and his ashes divided and buried in the north, the center, and the south of Vietnam, so that in death he would not be separated from any part of the country he had spent 60 years trying to free. The government did not honor that request. He was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Hanoi that remains a site of official commemoration today. The gap between what he asked for and what was done with him tells you something about the relationship between the man and the political system that claimed his legacy. His authority in North Vietnam during the war years was not primarily the authority of a strongman sustained by fear, though the government he led was authoritarian in ways the historical record does not allow to be softened. It was the authority of a man whose personal sacrifice and personal consistency gave him a moral credibility that organizational power alone cannot manufacture. He lived simply, dressed simply, had no family and no personal wealth, and had demonstrably given everything to a single cause for his entire adult life. In a political culture where the gap between leaders and population is usually visible in the display of privilege, he had closed that gap in ways that were genuine enough to be felt across the country. The political system he built was not a democracy by any recognizable definition. The Vietnamese Workers' Party exercised comprehensive control over political life. Dissent outside narrow permitted boundaries was suppressed. The land reform campaign of the mid-1950s, conducted with Soviet advisory input, resulted in the execution and imprisonment of people accused of being landlords or class enemies. Scholarly estimates of those killed vary widely in the historical literature, ranging from the low thousands to substantially higher figures depending on the sources and methodology used. And honest accounts must acknowledge that uncertainty. Ho Chi Minh publicly acknowledged in 1956 that the campaign had produced serious errors, an act unusual enough in communist governance of the era to be historically notable, though historians debate the degree to which it constituted a full accounting. Understanding North Vietnam's political character requires separating the question of regime type from the question of popular support for the war against foreign presence. These are genuinely different questions with genuinely different answers. The North Vietnamese government was authoritarian. The North Vietnamese population's commitment to national reunification and to expelling what they understood as a foreign military presence was, by the available evidence, genuine and broad. The experience of French colonialism, the memory of Japanese occupation, the presence of American bombs overhead, and the deep cultural attachment to the idea of Vietnam as a single nation all worked together to produce a level of popular mobilization that could not have been maintained through coercion alone across 2 decades of continuous warfare. The relationship between Hanoi and its 2 great communist patrons, the Soviet Union and China, was far more complicated than the Cold War framing that guided American policy suggested. Washington consistently described North Vietnam as an instrument of Soviet or Chinese expansion, a proxy whose actions reflected a coordinated communist strategy. The Vietnamese communists viewed their relationships with both powers with a strategic pragmatism that sometimes approached cynicism. They needed Soviet weapons and Chinese supplies. They did not want Soviet or Chinese control, and the historical record of their diplomacy shows consistent resistance to it. The decisions about how and when to fight were Vietnamese decisions, made in Hanoi according to Vietnamese strategic calculations. The war was being fought on Vietnamese terms, for Vietnamese objectives, by a movement whose motivations were rooted in Vietnamese history rather than in the directives of either great power patron. General Giap's military strategy was described in his own writings with a clarity that the American military took years to fully appreciate. Revolutionary War moves through phases determined by the relative strength of opposing forces. When the revolutionary force is weak, it avoids decisive engagement, builds its political base, and survives. As it grows stronger, it contests control of territory and population. When it is strong enough, it moves to conventional operations that achieve final victory. The timing of each phase is determined not by ideology, but by a cold assessment of the military balance and, critically, by the political situation of the adversary. That last element was Giap's most important analytical variable. He studied American domestic politics with an attention that sometimes exceeded the attention American analysts were paying to their own society's limits. He understood that a democratic government must manage casualties at a level its political system can sustain, that American elections create predictable cycles of political pressure, and that the gap between what the American government was telling its public and what was actually happening was a vulnerability that would compound over time. The strategy of protracted pressure was designed not to defeat America militarily, which GIEP understood was not achievable, but to make the political cost of continuing higher than the political cost of leaving. This was not a new strategic insight. It was the application of a proven framework, the same logic that had outlasted the Chinese and the French, to a new adversary. The specific details were different. The essential calculation was the same. The instrument of this strategy was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and understanding what that supply network represented in human terms is essential to any honest account of the war. The trail was not a road. It was a living system, evolving continuously in direct response to American efforts to destroy it. At its peak, it consisted of roughly 12,000 miles of routes running through the mountains and jungles of Laos and Cambodia, connecting North Vietnam to the battlefields of the South. It was maintained by an organization employing more than 100,000 soldiers and civilians at various points, moving fighters, weapons, food, and medical supplies southward in a continuous flow. American aircraft flew hundreds of thousands of sorties against the trail over the course of the entire war. The bombing was sustained and backed by sophisticated intelligence systems. It destroyed trucks and collapsed tunnels and cut roads with genuine effectiveness. It did not stop the trail. The people working it moved at night, concealed vehicles under jungle canopy during daylight, rebuilt damaged sections with a speed that consistently surprised American planners, and absorbed the losses and continued the logistical achievement the trail represented, moving an army's worth of supplies through some of the most heavily bombed terrain in military history without heavy equipment or paved roads, has few parallels in the history of warfare. The women who maintained sections of the trail and operated its supply networks were essential to that achievement and are essentially absent from American accounts of the war. Women's units cleared bomb damage, rebuilt road sections, guided convoys through the most dangerous stretches, and operated anti-aircraft positions along routes where a day without bombing was unusual. Casualty rates among some units were severe. Their contribution to the war's ultimate outcome was essential, not marginal. The experience of ordinary North Vietnamese civilians under the American bombing campaigns deserves honest accounting. North Vietnam in the 1960s was a poor agricultural country with a limited industrial base. The bombing campaigns killed civilians in numbers that American briefings consistently minimized. Independent estimates based on available evidence suggest civilian deaths from bombing in the North in the range of 40,000 to 70,000 over the course of the air campaigns. Though the genuine uncertainty in these estimates should be acknowledged, the North Vietnamese government's response was a civil defense mobilization of remarkable thoroughness. Industrial equipment was moved underground or dispersed. Urban populations were evacuated. Schools operated in tunnels. Hospitals moved critical facilities underground. The Bach Mai Hospital in Hanoi, damaged during the Christmas bombing of 1972, had been preparing underground facilities for years before those bombs fell. The organizational capacity required to sustain this mobilization for years across a population under continuous military pressure reflected both genuine popular commitment and the administrative reach of a government with comprehensive control over civil society. The experience in South Vietnam was different in character but comparable in cost. The Vietnamese who lived and died in the South were not simply a population waiting to be governed or liberated. They were a society with their own internal complexity, their own regional identities, their own religious communities, and their own range of relationships to both the Saigon government and the National Liberation Front. Millions of South Vietnamese fought and died for a country they genuinely believed in. Millions more lived through the war trying to survive, caught between forces that had not asked their permission before making their land into a battlefield. The Viet Cong's treatment of civilians was not without its own brutalities. The campaign of assassination against South Vietnamese government officials and community leaders killed thousands of people over the course of the war. The killings that occurred in Hue during the Tet Offensive, where North Vietnamese forces executed an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 civilians, including government officials, teachers, and religious figures, were genuine atrocities that communist accounts of the war have consistently minimized. Any honest reckoning with the war's full human cost must hold these facts alongside the American and South Vietnamese ones. Without the ideological filtering that treats one side's violence as necessity and the other side's violence as crime, the total cost of the war to Vietnam, North and South, resists precise calculation, and any honest account must present the available figures with appropriate uncertainty. Vietnam's official government estimate, released in 1995, counted approximately 2 million civilians killed, approximately 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters killed, and approximately 250,000 South Vietnamese military personnel killed. Demographic historians note that these figures are estimates subject to meaningful margins of error, given the conditions under which the war was fought and the records that were and were not kept. Place those numbers alongside the 58,281 Americans who died, and a different picture of proportionality emerges. For every American who died in Vietnam, by the ratios suggested by these estimates, roughly 50 Vietnamese died, on all sides, in their own country. Any account of the war that focuses primarily on the American experience is, in a fundamental sense, telling the smaller part of the story. What held the North Vietnamese war effort together through more than 20 years of continuous conflict, through casualties that would have broken most armies, through bombing that destroyed most of the country's urban infrastructure, was something that American strategy built around firepower and attrition was structurally unable to address. It was not ideology in the abstract. It was the specific, concrete, deeply felt conviction that Vietnam belonged to the Vietnamese, that foreign armies had been expelled before and would be expelled again, and that the cost of achieving that, whatever it finally turned out to be, was worth paying. General Maxwell Taylor, one of the senior American military advisors in Vietnam, wrote in a memorandum in 1964 that the United States was confronting a problem to which American military power had no solution. He was describing the political will of an adversary that had decided it would outlast whatever America chose to spend. The war continued for 11 more years after he wrote those words. Chapter 9. The Fall. On the morning of April 29, 1975, the American embassy in Saigon began burning its documents. Staff fed classified files into incinerators through the night and into the morning, reducing years of cables and reports and assessments to ash. The smoke rose above the embassy compound into a Saigon sky that was also carrying the sound of North Vietnamese artillery moving closer from the north and northwest. People had been gathering outside the embassy walls since the previous evening. Vietnamese who had worked for the Americans, who had built their lives around an assumption of American commitment, who had been told in various ways over many years that America would not abandon its allies. were trying to determine whether that promise was still operative. It was not, in the way they had understood it. It had not been for some time. To understand how that morning arrived, you have to go back to the Paris Peace Accords of January of 1973 and examine honestly what those accords actually were. They were not peace. They were an American exit with a ceasefire attached. The fundamental question that had been driving the conflict since 1945, who would govern Vietnam and under what political arrangements, was left entirely unresolved. The accords called for a political process to determine South Vietnam's future. But that process was defined in language so vague and so dependent on the good faith of parties who had been trying to kill each other for 20 years that no serious analyst believed it would function as written. Nixon and Kissinger understood this. Their private communications from this period make clear that the goal was not a permanent settlement, but what Kissinger described in various accounts as a decent interval. Enough time between the American departure and whatever followed it, that the connection between the two would not be politically immediate. Whether this framing was an honest acknowledgement of limited options or an insufficient reckoning with American obligations to the people whose fate the policy determined is one of the war's genuinely contested moral questions. And it deserves to be held as a question rather than answered too quickly in either direction. Nguyen Van Thieu, the South Vietnamese president, understood the accord's implications with the clarity of someone whose country's survival was directly at stake. He signed them under intense American pressure, including private warnings from Nixon that Congress would cut all aid if he continued to obstruct, and equally private assurances that America would respond with full military force if North Vietnam violated the ceasefire. Those assurances were personal commitments from a president who resigned in August of 1974 under the weight of the Watergate scandal. The political architecture that had made those promises credible collapsed with him. The ceasefire established by the Paris Accords lasted, in any meaningful sense, approximately 72 hours. Both sides violated it almost immediately. North Vietnamese forces, which the Accords had left in place in the South, consolidated and expanded their positions. The war continued at reduced intensity, but it continued. American military aid to South Vietnam continued after the withdrawal. Though at declining levels, the South Vietnamese military had been equipped and trained to fight an American-style war with American-scale logistics requirements. As aid levels fell, the gap between what the military required to function and what it received widened steadily. Maintenance backlogs, grounded aircraft, ammunition rationing reduced the effectiveness of infantry operations. The Army America had built was not a self-sustaining institution. It was an extension of American military power. And when that power withdrew, the extension began to wither. In August of 1974, Congress cut military aid to South Vietnam. More important than the specific dollar figure was what the cut signaled to Hanoi. America was disengaging. The political will to sustain the commitment had run out. The North Vietnamese Politburo was watching with the attention of people who had been studying American politics for a decade. In December of 1974, North Vietnamese forces attacked Phuoc Long province as a test. They took it within days. Washington did not respond militarily. The test had produced its answer. As Hanoi read it, America would not come back. The Politburo authorized a major offensive. The original plan was cautious, designed to take 2 years, with a final push anticipated in 1976. What actually happened moved so far beyond that planning that it required continuous revision almost from the first day. The Ho Chi Minh campaign began in March of 1975 with an attack on Ban Mi Thuo in the Central Highlands. The city fell in 2 days. Thieu made the most consequential military decision of the final phase, ordering a strategic withdrawal from the Central Highlands and the northern provinces to consolidate forces in a defensible perimeter around Saigon and the Mekong Delta. The withdrawal became a rout. South Vietnamese soldiers, cut off from families now behind advancing North Vietnamese lines, deserted in massive numbers to find their loved ones. The road south became choked with military vehicles and hundreds of thousands of civilian refugees moving in columns of desperate humanity that stretched for miles. North Vietnamese forces, moving faster than their own plans had anticipated, pressed the advantage with the methodical confidence of an army that had been preparing for this moment for 30 years. City after city fell with a speed that stunned observers who had spent decades being told the war was a stalemate. Hue, the ancient imperial capital that American Marines had fought for 25 days to retake during Tet of 1968, fell on March 25th. Da Nang, the second largest city in South Vietnam and home to one of the largest American military installations of the war years, fell on March 29th. In Washington, the Ford administration requested emergency military aid for South Vietnam from Congress. Congress refused. The debate that produced that refusal was not simply partisan. It reflected a genuine national exhaustion, with a commitment that had cost 58,000 American lives and hundreds of billions of dollars, and that no additional expenditure was going to change in any fundamental way. The American people and their representatives had reached, through a process that was messy and imperfect and sometimes ugly, the conclusion that had been available in the intelligence reports and field assessments since the early 1960s. The project was not working and could not be made to work. The evacuation of Saigon, code-named Operation Frequent Win, began on April 29th. 1975. It was supposed to be orderly. North Vietnamese rocket attacks on Tan Son Nhat Airport rendered fixed-wing operations impossible within hours of the evacuation's start. The operation shifted entirely to helicopters. For 18 hours, American helicopters flew continuous sorties between ships offshore and pickup points throughout Saigon, carrying out American personnel, embassy staff, and as many Vietnamese as could be loaded aboard each aircraft. The images from those hours became among the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century. The crowds at the embassy walls, the lines at rooftop landing zones, the helicopters pushed overboard from aircraft carrier decks to make room for more incoming flights. The image most often associated with those hours, a helicopter above a rooftop with people on a ladder below it, was taken not at the American embassy, but at a CIA residential building on Gia Long Street, where CIA station personnel were being evacuated. The misidentification has persisted for 50 years. It does not diminish the image's power, because what the image communicates is not a specific location. It is a specific condition. The end of something. The running out of time and options and promises that had been made and could not be kept. The Vietnamese who had worked most closely with Americans faced the most immediate danger. Tens of thousands of people who had every reason to believe the American commitment was genuine were left behind. Some would spend years in re-education camps. Some would eventually join the wave of refugees who crossed the South China Sea in the years that followed. Their fates were the most personal and most lasting consequence of the distance between what had been promised and what was delivered. At 11:53 in the morning of April 30th, 1975, a North Vietnamese tank crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. A soldier climbed to the roof and raised a flag. General Duong Van Minh, who had taken power 2 days earlier specifically to negotiate a surrender, was waiting inside. 21 years after the Geneva Accords had temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, The country was unified under a single government. It was not the government that Washington had spent 20 years and 58,000 lives trying to prevent. April 30th means different things depending on where you stand and what you lost. In Vietnam, it is Liberation Day, the culmination of a 30-year struggle for national independence and reunification among the Vietnamese diaspora, particularly those who fled and built new lives in other countries. It is called Black April, a day of mourning for a country lost and a life interrupted. Both responses are genuine. Both point to the same events and reach opposite conclusions. The fact that this is possible is itself one of the most important things the war has to teach about the distance between history as it is experienced by different people who live through the same events. The helicopter on the rooftop was not a symbol of defeat in some abstract geopolitical sense. It was the visible endpoint of a specific chain of decisions, made over 30 years by specific people in specific rooms, each of whom believed they were making the best available choice given the pressures they faced. The cumulative result of those choices was what the world saw on April 29, 1975, in the smoke above the embassy and the crowds outside its walls. The people burning the documents were doing their jobs under impossible conditions. The people outside the walls were doing what people do when the promises that organize their lives turn out not to be keepable. And the people of Vietnam, North and South, who had lived through 30 years of continuous war, were about to discover that the end of one kind of suffering does not always mean the beginning of ease. Chapter 10. The Wounds That Didn't Heal. In the spring of 1971, a 27-year-old Navy veteran named John Kerry sat before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in Washington and asked a question on behalf of the Vietnam veterans against the war he had served. He had been awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and 3 Purple Hearts. He was not a draft dodger or someone who had found a way around the service he was now criticizing. He was a man who had been there, who had done what his country asked, and who had come home to a conclusion that his credentials made it impossible to dismiss in the usual ways. He asked how you asked a man to be the last man to die for a mistake. The chamber went quiet in the specific way that happens when a question cannot be answered by any of the available official responses. It was not rhetorical. It was the central moral problem of the war, stated as plainly as it had ever been stated in an official setting, by someone who had earned the right to state it. What many Americans did with that question was feel it as an accusation. If the war was a mistake, every name on the wall was the name of someone who died for a mistake. That was a truth so painful that a significant portion of the country chose, for years and sometimes decades, to look away from it rather than look at it directly. The looking away produced a particular kind of damage to the veterans caught in the middle of it. The experience of Vietnam veterans returning home is one of the least admirable chapters in how America handled the war's human cost. And understanding it honestly requires resisting 2 competing myths that have distorted the reality in opposite directions. The first is the image of the universally rejected veteran, spat upon by protesters and condemned by a country that blamed the soldiers for a war the politicians had started. There is genuine evidence that some veterans experienced hostility and contempt. Veterans who returned in uniform sometimes changed to civilian clothes before leaving airports. The absence of the welcome home ceremonies that World War II veterans had received was felt as a specific and painful absence by men who had served with the same commitment their fathers had shown. The indifference of a country that had moved on was experienced by many veterans as a form of rejection that compounded what the war itself had done to them. The second myth portrays the Vietnam veteran as uniformly damaged and potentially dangerous. the crazed vet of 100 films and television dramas, carrying the war home in ways that made him a threat to himself and others. Rates of post-traumatic stress, substance abuse, and certain social difficulties were genuinely elevated among Vietnam veterans compared to both the general population and veterans of other conflicts. But the image flattened more than 2.5 million people who served in Vietnam into a single archetype that served the cultural need to process collective guilt through its most visible human casualties. Most Vietnam veterans came home and resumed their lives, raised families, held jobs, and carried what they had seen and done in ways that were not always visible on the surface. What was nearly universal was the experience of returning to a country that had not developed any coherent way of acknowledging what its soldiers had done or what had been done to them. The condition that would eventually be named post-traumatic stress disorder was not formally recognized in the American Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual until 1980, 5 years after the fall of Saigon. Before that recognition, veterans who experienced flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, and emotional numbing were frequently told by military and civilian physicians alike that what they were experiencing reflected a personal weakness rather than a predictable psychological response to extreme trauma. The treatment gap this produced had real and lasting consequences for men whose suffering the medical system had not yet learned to name. The physical legacy of the war extended beyond the battlefield in ways the government was slow to acknowledge. Agent Orange, the herbicide defoliant used throughout the war, contained a dioxin contaminant that is among the most toxic substances produced by industrial chemistry. American aircraft sprayed approximately 11 million gallons over the Vietnamese countryside between 1961 and 1971, exposing American soldiers, Vietnamese fighters, and Vietnamese civilians to contamination, whose health consequences researchers are still documenting more than 50 years later. The Veterans Administration's recognition of the link between Agent Orange exposure and specific cancers and other conditions was slow and driven more by veteran advocacy and litigation than by proactive government responsibility. Decades passed between the war's end and full acknowledgement of the obligation owed to men whose health had been damaged by a substance their own military had used around them. In Vietnam, the dioxin contamination of soil and water in some areas persists today. The children and grandchildren of people with high exposure continue to be born with birth defects at rates that epidemiological research links to the contamination. This is not a closed chapter. The political legacy of Vietnam is harder to measure than the physical and psychological ones, but in some ways more consequential for what came after. The most visible political consequence was what analysts called the Vietnam Syndrome, the deep reluctance in American public opinion and in significant portions of the political and military establishment to commit American forces to foreign conflicts. The syndrome expressed itself differently in different contexts. Sometimes it reflected healthy skepticism about official claims of necessity. Sometimes it produced paralysis in situations where action might have been warranted. The Iran hostage crisis of 1979, the withdrawal from Beirut after the Marine barracks bombing of 1983, the decade-long reluctance to intervene in the Balkans during the 1990s, all bore in different degrees the marks of a political culture that had been burned and was not ready to trust its own judgment about when the use of force was appropriate. The military itself underwent a transformation after Vietnam that represented one of the most serious institutional self-examinations in American government. The shift to an all-volunteer force, the development of new operational doctrine, the rebuilding of unit cohesion and professional standards, the investment in training that produced the force that performed effectively in the Gulf War of 1991 were all, in significant part, responses to lessons that honest military professionals drew from Vietnam's failures. The professional military culture that developed explicitly valued honest internal assessment over institutional optimism, challenged assumptions rather than simply executing them, and asked whether strategies were working rather than simply measuring outputs. These were direct reactions to the culture of the 5 o'clock follies and the body count metrics that had corrupted military reporting throughout the war. The cultural processing of Vietnam happened through literature and film in waves that are still continuing. Tim O'Brien's works, particularly The Things They Carried, published in 1990, approached the experience of the American soldier with a moral and psychological honesty that no official account had managed. Michael Herr's Dispatches, published in 1977, captured the sensory and spiritual disorientation of reporting the war in prose that reads more like poetry than journalism. Neil Sheehan's A Bright Shining Lie, published in 1988, used the life of John Paul Vann, an American military advisor who understood the war's failures earlier than almost anyone around him and could not stop them, as a lens through which the entire American experience became legible. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington is the most powerful physical expression of what the war left behind in American public life. Its design, selected through a national competition in 1981, was submitted by Maya Lin, a 21-year-old Yale architecture student who proposed a wall of black granite set into the earth, bearing the names of the dead in chronological order so that the names of people who died together would appear together. The design was immediately controversial. Critics called it a black gash of shame, a design that expressed defeat rather than honor. The controversy produced a compromise, the addition of a figurative sculpture nearby. But the wall, once opened in November of 1982, did something no one had precisely predicted. It worked. People came, touched the names, left objects. The reflective surface showed visitors their own faces alongside the names of the dead, creating a relationship between the living and those the war had taken that no designer could have fully calculated in advance. The wall has received more than 400,000 objects since it opened. Park rangers collect them each night and archive them in a facility in Maryland. The collection includes combat medals and children's drawings, wedding rings and combat boots, letters addressed to the dead by people who needed somewhere to send them, cans of beer left for friends who never came home. Each object is a story the country had no other way to tell. What the wall did was give the grief somewhere specific to go. The country had not agreed on what the war meant, and has still not agreed. But the grief was real regardless of the meaning. And the wall held it in a way that nothing else had managed to do. Carey's question, from 1971. How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? Was never answered in the official sense. He was asking it. What happened instead was something slower and less complete. The wall was built. The books were written. The veterans spoke. Some of them about what they had seen and carried home. And the country, imperfectly and incompletely, and over a much longer period than anyone would have chosen, began the process of looking at what it had done. Chapter 11. What Vietnam Became. She is a composite of millions. Think of her this way. A teacher in Saigon on the morning of April 30th, 1975. Standing at a window watching North Vietnamese tanks move through the streets below. She represents the experience of millions of South Vietnamese civilians, whose individual stories, the official histories, rarely captured in full. people whose lives were shaped by a war they had not chosen and whose peace would be defined by a victory they had not sought. She felt two things simultaneously that morning that she would spend years trying to reconcile. The first was relief. The war was over. The bombing was over. The years of fear, the sound of aircraft overhead that she had lived with since she was a child, were over. Her children would grow up in a country at peace. Whatever came next, the killing had stopped. The second was dread. She did not know what the new government would make of her history. Her husband's service in the South Vietnamese military, her years of work for a government that had just ceased to exist. She did not know whether the relief about the war's end would survive the first weeks of what came after it. Both feelings turned out to be accurate. The war ended. The peace had its own costs. The government that took power over unified Vietnam in 1975 carried the habits and assumptions of a movement that had spent 30 years in wartime. Its relationship to political opposition was shaped by decades of experience in which opposition could mean death. And it applied that framework to a Southern population that included millions of people whose relationship to the previous government ranged from active collaboration to simple civic employment. The re-education camps, established across the South within months of reunification, held between 200,000 and 300,000 people by most estimates. Primarily former South Vietnamese military officers, government officials, and people whose professional backgrounds made them targets of the new government's security concerns. Conditions varied widely by location and period. Some facilities were relatively mild internment. Others involved inadequate food, forced labor, disease, and physical mistreatment. Periods of detention ranged from months to years. Several thousand people died in the camps, a figure that is both real and contested in its precise magnitude. The survivors who eventually made it to the United States carried experiences that shaped the Vietnamese American community in ways that are still felt today. The economic policies imposed on the South added another layer of difficulty to the immediate post-war period. The collectivization of agriculture and commerce, applied with ideological consistency that did not adequately account for the specific conditions of the Southern economy, disrupted the agricultural productivity of the Mekong Delta, one of the most naturally productive rice-growing regions in the world. Business owners had enterprises confiscated, shortages developed in a country with every natural endowment needed to feed itself well. The result was one of the largest refugee crises in Asian history since the partition of the Indian subcontinent. The boat people, the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who fled by sea between 1975 and the late 1980s, represent one of the most dramatic and most overlooked sequels to the war's end. They left in fishing boats and makeshift vessels and anything that would carry them across the South China Sea toward Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Hong Kong. The journey was extraordinarily dangerous. Piracy in the South China Sea during this period was epidemic, and the violence visited on refugees attempting the crossing was severe. Estimates of deaths at sea vary widely in the scholarly literature, with some placing the figure in the hundreds of thousands, though the genuine uncertainty in any estimate made under these conditions should be acknowledged. Those who survived the crossing faced years in refugee camps before resettlement in third countries. The United States accepted roughly 800,000 Vietnamese refugees in the years after the war. The Vietnamese American community that developed primarily in California, Texas, and Virginia built one of the most economically successful immigrant communities in American history, while carrying a grief for a country lost that shaped the community's politics and internal culture for generations. Vietnam also fought two more wars in the years immediately after 1975, a fact that rarely appears in the standard account. The first was against the Khmer Rouge government in Cambodia, which had come to power in April of 1975 and was conducting the genocide that killed an estimated 1.7 million Cambodians, roughly a quarter of the country's population. Vietnam invaded Cambodia in December of 1978 and overthrew the Khmer Rouge, ending the Khmer Rouge's genocidal rule. Though the organization continued as an armed movement for years afterward, the military operation almost certainly saved lives in numbers difficult to calculate precisely. It also began a 10-year Vietnamese occupation that drew international condemnation, triggered economic sanctions, and contributed to the isolation that kept Vietnam among the poorest countries in Asia through the 1980s. The second war was against China, which invaded northern Vietnam in February of 1979 in response to the Cambodian intervention. The Sino-Vietnamese War lasted approximately 1 month and ended inconclusively. China suffered heavier casualties than anticipated against a Vietnamese military that had just finished 30 years of continuous warfare. The conflict confirmed Vietnam's strategic isolation and its dependence on Soviet support. By the mid-1980s, Vietnam was a country in genuine crisis. The centrally planned economy was producing shortages rather than growth. The combination of wartime destruction, post-war policias, international isolation, and the costs of the Cambodian occupation had created a situation that even committed ideologues within the Vietnamese Communist Party could not attribute entirely to external causes. The response was deux mois, meaning renovation, a set of economic reforms introduced at the 6th National Congress of the Vietnamese Communist Party in December of 1986. The reforms abandoned collectivized agriculture, opened the economy to foreign investment, and permitted private enterprise in sectors that had been state monopolies. The one-party political system remained unchanged. The bargain being struck was economic opening without political opening. The same arrangement China had been pursuing since Deng Xiaoping's reforms began in 1978. The results transformed Vietnam within a decade. The country went from being a food importer facing periodic shortages to one of the world's largest rice exporters. The poverty rate fell with a speed that development economists described as among the most rapid reductions in absolute poverty recorded in the 20th century. By the early 2000s, Vietnam was sustaining annual economic growth rates regularly exceeding 7%. The normalization of relations with the United States, formally completed in July of 1995 under President Bill Clinton, was both a practical economic step and a symbolic one carrying considerable emotional weight. Clinton flew to Hanoi and stood before cameras in the country that had defined his generation's political consciousness and spoke about former enemies becoming partners. The trade relationship that followed became one of America's most significant economic partnerships in Southeast Asia. The American veterans who returned to Vietnam in the years after normalization, and tens of thousands of them did, often described encounters of a generosity that sat uneasily against the weight of the history. Vietnamese people who had lost family members in the war extended hospitality to American visitors in ways that seemed to operate independent of what the history should have made possible. The Vietnamese have a phrase, "Kep lai qua hu," meaning close the past, that reflects a cultural orientation toward forward movement. Whether that orientation represents genuine reconciliation, pragmatic necessity, or something of both is a question that people on both sides of the Pacific continue to answer differently. The Teacher at the Window on April 30th, 1975, representing the millions whose stories this account can only suggest, lived through all of it. She navigated the new Vietnam, built a life in it, watched her children grow up in it. The two feelings she had that morning, the relief that the killing had stopped and the dread of what came next, were both vindicated by what actually happened. The war ended. The peace had its own costs. The country survived both and became something that neither feeling, standing alone at the window that morning, could have predicted. The generation born after the war, the young Vietnamese in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi and Da Nang, who build their lives in a country at peace and growing, carry the war as inherited history, present in the official narrative and in family stories, not lived experience. They are further from the war than their parents were, and that distance is not forgetfulness. It is what survival looks like when it has had enough time to become something other than endurance. Chapter 12. The Lessons That Weren't Learned. In the months before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, General Anthony Zinni, who had commanded American forces in the Middle East and who had spent years developing what he believed was a nuanced understanding of the region's politics, publicly opposed the war before it began. In subsequent accounts he gave after leaving government, he described his growing recognition that the architecture of the case being made for the invasion bore a troubling resemblance to patterns he had observed before, not the details. The details were entirely different. Iraq was not Vietnam. The terrain was different. The enemy was different. The strategic context was different. The American military that would conduct the operation had been comprehensively rebuilt since Vietnam in ways that made it genuinely more capable across multiple dimensions. It was the structure, the confidence that military force would produce political outcomes the planners had not fully mapped, the absence of a convincing answer to the question of what the country would look like when the military phase ended, and who would govern it, and on what basis. The gap between the assurances being offered in official settings and what the more careful regional analyses were suggesting privately. Zinni's concerns were dismissed. The war proceeded. The initial military campaign in the spring of 2003 was swift and tactically impressive by almost any measure. The conventional phase was over in weeks. The Iraqi army collapsed. Baghdad fell. And then the insurgency began. And the familiar architecture reassembled itself with a speed that should not have surprised anyone who had studied what happens when an occupied population that has not asked to be occupied develops resistance. The resistance was not unified or ideologically coherent. It encompassed former Ba'athist loyalists, Sunni tribalists, foreign jihadists, and ordinary Iraqis who objected to the presence of foreign soldiers in their streets for reasons that required no ideology. It drew support from a population that resented the disruption of daily life, the civilian casualties that are the unavoidable byproduct of counterinsurgency operations in populated areas, and the visible evidence that the promised benefits of liberation were not arriving on the promised schedule. Think of an Iraqi shopkeeper in Baghdad in the summer of 2003, opening his store each morning past a checkpoint he did not ask for, watching his neighborhood's familiar patterns disrupted by the presence of soldiers who did not speak his language and did not always understand the customs they were policing. He did not necessarily support the insurgency. He did not necessarily oppose the Americans. He was navigating a situation that had been imposed on his life by decisions made in other cities by people he had never met. The same essential position that Vietnamese civilians had occupied for decades. And his daily calculation about which way to lean would eventually determine more about the war's outcome than any military operation. The people who planned the Iraq War were not ignorant of Vietnam. Several of them had served in it or had studied it closely. What they had concluded from Vietnam, or what they had allowed themselves to conclude, was a set of lessons selected to support what they wanted to do, rather than to constrain it. The lesson they drew was that Vietnam had been lost because of insufficient political will at home, because the media had turned public opinion against a war that was militarily manageable, because politicians had micromanaged military commanders and prevented them from doing what the situation required. This interpretation, sometimes called the stab-in-the-back narrative by historians who have examined it critically, located the cause of defeat in the failures of others rather than in the fundamental premises of the strategy itself. Most serious historians of the Vietnam War find this interpretation incomplete at best. Vietnam was not lost because Walter Cronkite gave a pessimistic broadcast or because protesters marched in the streets. It was lost because the fundamental premises of American strategy were flawed in ways that more political will would not have corrected. Because the United States had committed to defending a government that lacked the legitimacy to survive without permanent external support. Because the military strategy of attrition could not achieve the political outcome the war required. Because policymakers consistently confused military capability with strategic effectiveness. The Iraq War's planners drew different lessons because the accurate ones were too constraining. If the actual lesson of Vietnam was that you cannot substitute military power for political legitimacy, then the entire premise of creating a functioning democratic state in Iraq through invasion and occupation was called into question before the first tank crossed the border. The surge of American forces in 2007 produced genuine security improvements in Baghdad and several other areas. General David Petraeus applied counterinsurgency principles derived significantly from the study of what had gone wrong in Vietnam and achieved results that were real and observable. Violence declined substantially in the surge's immediate aftermath. The surge did not resolve the underlying political problem. The Iraqi government did not use the security space the surge created to build the cross-sectarian legitimacy that stability required. When American combat forces eventually left, the conditions that had produced the insurgency had not been addressed in any fundamental way. The Islamic State, which seized large portions of Iraq and Syria beginning in 2013 and 14, emerged directly from the political and security vacuum the Iraq War had created, and that the surge had temporarily stabilized without filling. Afghanistan followed a trajectory with a structural resemblance to Vietnam that was difficult to avoid even for people who most wanted to avoid it. The initial campaign in 2001 was swift. The Taliban government that had hosted the September 11th attackers was driven from power within months. A new government was installed in Kabul. The war did not end. The Afghan government America sponsored had endemic corruption, limited reach outside the capital, and insufficient popular legitimacy to survive without external support. The Taliban had roots in the rural population that military force could suppress temporarily but not eliminate. Afghanistan's own history was, like Vietnam's, a history of outlasting foreign armies. And that history was as present in Afghan consciousness as the tradition of resistance had been in Vietnamese consciousness. According to Brown University's Costs of War project, the United States spent more than $2 trillion in Afghanistan over 20 years. More than 2,400 American service members died in direct military operations. According to Department of Defense figures, the Afghan security forces trained and equipped at enormous cost collapsed in 11 days in August of 2021 as American forces completed their withdrawal. The Taliban took Kabul. The airport became the site of scenes that carried an unmistakable visual echo of Saigon in April of 1975. Afghans who had built their lives around the assumption that the American commitment was durable crowded the tarmac trying to board aircraft that could not take all of them. The veterans watching those images recognized the structure, not the details. The structure, the real lesson of Vietnam, the one that keeps not being applied, is not primarily a military lesson. It is a political one. Military power, however overwhelming, cannot substitute for political legitimacy. You cannot build a functional state for another people by imposing one from outside. The population of the country being intervened in has its own history, its own interests, and its own judgment about what its future should look like. And that judgment will ultimately determine the outcome, regardless of how many troops are deployed or how much money is spent. This lesson is not complicated or obscure. It appears in virtually every serious post-mortem of the Vietnam War written across the political spectrum. It appears in Robert McNamara's late memoir, in which he spent the final decades of his life publicly wrestling with decisions he came to believe were catastrophic mistakes. It appears in the Pentagon Papers. It appears in the field assessments of commanders who served in Vietnam and tried to tell their superiors what was not working. The Pentagon Papers revealed a specific and disturbing pattern. Officials at every level consistently had access to analyses questioning whether the strategy was working, and consistently chose to continue rather than change course in any fundamental way. The reason was the asymmetry between costs. Admitting that the strategy was fundamentally flawed meant admitting that the lives already spent had been spent for something that could not be achieved. That was a weight the political system could not easily carry. Continuing meant more lives, but preserved the possibility, however diminishing, that the corner might still be turned. In the context of war, where the costs being deferred are measured in human lives, this asymmetry between the political cost of admitting failure and the human cost of continuing is not simply a cognitive error. It is a specific kind of institutional failure that democratic governments are structurally vulnerable to, and that the reforms those governments have made since Vietnam have not adequately addressed the conversation about whether the lessons of Vietnam have been genuinely learned, honestly, and with enough institutional commitment to actually change behavior, is one that each generation has to have for itself. What the historical record provides is clear documentation of what the failure to learn those lessons costs. Chapter 13. The War That Never Ends. On any given day, someone is at the wall, not a crowd, not a ceremony, not an organized event, just a person or a small group standing before the black granite in whatever weather Washington has that morning, moving slowly along its length, reading as they go, until they find the name they came for. Then they stop. Some stay for a long time. Some leave something, a photograph, a letter, a medal, a small object that connects them to the name in the stone. Some make a rubbing on paper to carry home. Some stand in silence and then walk away without expression, having done what they needed to do in a way that required no witness and no explanation. The wall has been receiving these visitors since November of 1982. It has received more than 400,000 objects. The collection includes combat medals and children's drawings, wedding rings and combat boots, letters addressed to people who cannot read them, cans of beer left for friends who never came home. Each object is a story the country had no other way to tell. The wall works because it does not try to resolve the argument. It does not tell you whether the war was worth it. It does not assign blame or distribute honor in any proportion that any particular position would find satisfying. It holds the names and asks you to stand there with them, and whatever you bring to that standing is your own. The question this documentary began with was specific. How do you lose a war you were never supposed to lose? And what does that do to a nation? The first part has an answer that the preceding chapters have tried to construct honestly, drawing on the documentary record and the assessments of historians who have spent decades examining it. You lose it by committing to a strategy that is disconnected from the political reality it is supposed to serve. You lose it by building official narratives that cannot accommodate honest assessments of failure without threatening the political system that produced them. You lose it by misunderstanding the nature of your adversary so fundamentally that your greatest advantages become irrelevant to the actual contest being decided. You lose it by asking young people to die for objectives that their commanders privately doubt can be achieved, and that the government cannot explain to the public in terms that make the cost seem proportionate to the benefit. And you lose it by not being willing to say any of that plainly until the saying so has become unavoidable. And the cost of the delay has been paid in the currency that wars always finally extract. The second part of the question, what does that do to a nation, has been unfolding for 50 years and is not finished. It divided a generation in ways that have never fully healed. The men who served and the men who did not. The families who lost someone and the families who did not. The veterans who came home and found a country that had no coherent way of acknowledging what they had done or what had been done to them. The protesters who believed they were opposing a wrong and who spent decades being told by some of the people they had opposed that their opposition had cost lives. All of these people carry different and sometimes irreconcilable relationships to the same events. And those different relationships have made Vietnam genuinely difficult to discuss as a shared history rather than as competing parallel ones. It changed the relationship between the American government and the American people in ways that have not recovered and may not. The level of institutional trust that existed before Vietnam, the basic assumption that elected officials and military commanders were operating in good faith with accurate information, was damaged in ways that time has not fully repaired. Whether that damage was the inevitable consequence of what the government actually did, or whether it could have been avoided through different choices at different moments, is a question that people answer differently based on what they believe democratic institutions are capable of and obligated to do. It produced a body of art and literature that constitutes one of the most sustained cultural reckonings with war in American history. The works that Vietnam generated, from Tim O'Brien's fiction to Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's 18-hour documentary series, represent a genuine national attempt, imperfect and ongoing, to be honest about an experience that resists easy honesty. The Vietnamese who lived through the war and its aftermath carry their own relationship to it that no American account can fully capture. The North Vietnamese veterans who came home to a country celebrating their victory but could not always provide the care their sacrifice deserved. The South Vietnamese veterans who came home, those who survived the camps, to a country that had decided their service was on the wrong side of history. The civilians, North and South, who lost family members and years of their lives to a conflict that arrived from outside and stayed longer than any of them had chosen. The teacher at the window on April 30th, 1975, representing the millions whose experiences the official histories rarely fully captured, lived through the decades that followed. She navigated the new Vietnam, built a life in it, watched her children grow up in it. The two feelings she had that morning, the relief that the killing had stopped and the dread of what came next, were both vindicated by what actually happened. The country survived both and became something that neither feeling, standing alone at the window that morning, could have predicted. The generation born after the war, the young Vietnamese in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi and Da Nang, who build their lives in a country at peace and growing, carry the war as inherited history, present in the curriculum and in family stories, not lived experience. They are further from the war than their parents were. And that distance is not forgetfulness. It is what survival looks like when it has had enough time to become something other than endurance. The reconciliation between Americans and Vietnamese, partial and imperfect as it is one of the quietly remarkable outcomes of the decades since the fighting stopped. Countries that fought each other with this level of violence and this degree of mutual incomprehension for this length of time do not usually build functional, diplomatic, and economic relationships within 20 years of the last shot. That they did reflects the pragmatism of both governments and the genuine human capacity to move past pain that seems to operate in some circumstances, even when the history argues against it. Reconciliation does not erase what happened. It does not restore the dead, or compensate the survivors, or resolve the historical arguments. What it creates is the practical conditions under which people on both sides can begin to do something with the war, other than continue it by other means. The names on the wall are not a verdict. They are not an argument for any particular position in the debates that have surrounded this war for 50 years. They are 58,281 specific human beings who came to the end of their lives in a place far from home, in service of a cause that the country that sent them there has still not fully agreed on how to describe. Each of those names arrived at the wall through a chain of decisions made by people who believed, or told themselves they believed, that those decisions were necessary. The presidents who escalated, the generals who designed the strategies, the officials who wrote the memoranda acknowledging what the strategies were not achieving and recommended continuing them anyway, the journalists who reported what they saw and the briefers who described something different, the protesters who marched and the soldiers who served and the families who waited and the families who received the telegram, all of them were part of it. The failure of Vietnam was not the failure of any single person or any single decision. It was the cumulative result of ordinary human failures at institutional scale, careerism and political calculation, and the specific difficulty of admitting, in public and at cost, that the evidence had turned against the policy you had committed to. The same kind of failures that appear in different forms in every large institution that has ever faced a problem it could not solve but could not acknowledge it could not solve. The wall holds the names. The archive holds 400,000 objects. The books hold the arguments. The families hold the grief. And somewhere in all of that, if you look at it honestly and without the protection of a conclusion decided before the looking began, is something that functions as a lesson. Not a simple lesson that reduces to a doctrine or a policy prescription. A lesson about the relationship between democratic governments and the truth. About what happens when the systems designed to allow honest reckoning with failure are corrupted by the political convenience of pretending otherwise. About the specific and irreplaceable cost of that corruption, measured in names on granite. John Kerry asked in 1971 how you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake. The question was never answered in the official sense he was asking it. What happened instead was something slower and less complete. The wall was built. The books were written. The veterans spoke. Some of them about what they had seen and done and carried home. And the country, imperfectly and incompletely and over a much longer period than anyone would have chosen, began the process of looking at what it had done. On a mountain road in North Vietnam, the young woman who worked in the dark to keep the supplies moving south was doing what her country asked of her, as the young men on the other side of the war were doing what their country asked of them, that these two things were happening simultaneously, with equal commitment and equal cost, to people who had never met and never would, is the essential human reality of the Vietnam War. Not a story about one side, a story about what it costs. On every side, when nations cannot find any way other than war to resolve the questions that divide them, the wall is still there. The names are still there. The question of what we owe the people whose names we carry, in honesty and in the quality of the decisions we make in their shadow, is still waiting for an answer worthy of the asking. That conversation is still going. You are now part of it.